All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our February State and Federal Programs Directors Meeting. Hard to believe it is already February. The year is more than half over. I hope you're all warm and dry this morning and safe. Today, you're going to hear from most of our team in the following order: Rachel Garcia, Helen Choi, Anita Lomali, Adrian Balcazar, and Jeannie Key. I'd also like to give a special welcome to our behind the scenes support person, and that's Christine Young. I'm sure some of you know her. If you've called our office, she takes care of all your needs and she makes sure everything works for us. So you don't see her, but she is also here and an important part of our team. So thanks, Christine. You'll find a link in the chat, thanks to Christine, for the meeting. So if you go to that link, you'll find our handouts, you'll find the slides, and we will have the presentation recording posted there. Usually it's there within about 24 hours. So everything will be at that link. So let's get started and take a look at our agenda. And first of all, we're going to start off by looking at just a few updates and reminders. And then we're going to spend some time reviewing equitable services requirements for serving private schools. We're going to have our annual workshop on this next month, and Rachel will share a little bit about that with you. But we want to make sure everyone's aware of the requirements, since it's that time of year when we should be thinking about the consultation part of that process. So that will be first up on the agenda after our updates. We also got a new list of CSI and ATSI schools. I think that came out either near or just after our last meeting. So we're going to be taking a look at some of the requirements related to those schools. And then we're going to have an FPM update that's really going to focus on compliance requirements related to CSI and ATSI schools. And finally, the LCAP update. We're going to focus on CSI related requirements in the LCAP for the written description of district support. And then also there's a list of schools that have some required goals that was also released recently. So we will have an update on that. So that is our agenda for today. And if, as usual, please put your questions in the chat. We'll get a Q&A out to you. Will be posted on the website with the link in the chat, and also we send it out to you and to anyone who is on our sign up list, our listserv. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And yes, here's the link again to find. We're going to make sure you find any handouts. We'll be at that link. All right, now we're on to reminders and updates. And we just had three things that we wanted to talk about. First of all, ESSER and GEAR reporting, just a reminder there. Wanted to clarify some things about mid-year LCAP reporting, and then an update on the CONAP submission. So that's those are our topics, just a couple short ones there. So let's start with ESSER and GEAR. And this is just a reminder, this slide is just a reminder about Ed Relief funding over the last several years. So as a reminder, there have been three separate congressional acts authorizing funds, and they're all under the umbrella of the Education Stabilization Fund. Two of the key sources for local education agencies, a lot of money came under those appropriations, but for local education agencies was ESSER, and that's the Elementary and Secondary Emergency Relief Funds. And they were the major funding source that went directly to LEAs in response to COVID. And then also the other one that came to us a little more indirectly was GEAR, and that was the governor's emergency relief fund. And that went through the governor's office, but in California, it supported a lot of LEA programs. So we have reporting on both of those programs. Because they were authorized under different bills at different times, these programs have different ending dates. So you want to be aware of that. So first of all, we had the CARES Act. That was the first one that came out in response to COVID. And that came out in 2020, early, just after COVID broke out. And the end date for that was last September. So those funds have expired, but there's still reporting requirements on that. So September 30th of 2022 was the end of the obligation period for your CARES Act funds. Now, the next one, CARISA, which was the Coronavirus Response and Supplemental Appropriations Act, that came out early in 2021, and the end date on that will be this year, September 30th of 2023. So you want to be cognizant of that. That date is coming up for the end of the obligation period. For that would be ESSER 2 is what you would refer to it probably in your district. And then finally was the American Rescue Plan, the ARP funds, which is ESSER 3. Those came out also in 2021, but late in the year in 2021. So their obligation period ends on September 30th, 2024. So those are the latest ones that you will have access to. So those are moving along. Just a reminder where this money came from and that they are 3 separate bills, but they were essentially the same focus. All right, next slide. Let's take a look at what the reporting requirements. So all 3 of these funding sources include requirements for reporting, and the reporting includes both quarterly and annual reports to CDE. And there are a couple links above that will be helpful to you. The first one is actually to the logon site. So your district or your charter school should have a code that you can go in, a password, and that's where you go in to do the reporting. So that's the first link. And then there's another very helpful page, and that's the reporting help pages. And that's the second link there. And that has guidance and support, answers all kinds of questions about the reporting. So it's very helpful there if something comes up when you're trying to report. Okay. But just a reminder, there are quarterly and there are annual reports for all of those funds. So let's take a look at what's coming up. And that is the next thing that's coming up is an annual report. And this is going to be the 3rd annual report. So your district, your charter has done this 2 times before. And the annual report, it includes all 3 authorizations. So you'll be reporting on those funds under CARES Act, under CARISA, and under the American Rescue Plan, ESSER 1, 2, and 3. All of them are reported on. The annual report is going to be due on March 28th. So that's coming up very, very soon. And it's actually earlier than last year. Last year, that report was due in May. So if folks in your district are thinking it's May, or make sure you let them know, no, that's coming a lot sooner this year. The annual report is for last year's expenditures. It covers the period from July 1st of 2021 through June 30th of 2022. So this is for the annual period last year. And the next thing coming up very soon is going to be the quarterly report. And this is just a list of all the reports for ESSER 3, starting with the annual report, the one that's coming up that's due on the 28th, and all the reporting. So you can see a lot of reporting on these programs. And if you go to that help page that we shared the link for just a minute ago, you can find a link there that will take you to a schedule like this for all 3 of the fund sources. So you can see what's coming up, what's past. But this just kind of gives you an idea of the scope of the reporting on this. So it's been a heavy lift for you guys. So kudos, good job on that. All right, so what is reported? All right. Everything that was required was included in an email message from CDE that you should have received on January 25th. It's a really nice summary of everything that's required pretty much. It doesn't go into the details, but it gives you kind of the 1, 2, 3 of what you have to report. We have put a copy of that in our handout, so we just copied that. If your email is as full as I'm sure it is and you can't find it, we have a copy of it for you, but it's a summary. So based on that email, LEAs are going to have to report expenditures for ESSER 1, 2, and 3 according to the 4 categories listed on the slide. So addressing physical health and safety, meeting students' academic, social, emotional, and other needs, mental health supports for students and staff, and lastly, operational continuity and other allowable uses. So those are the categories of reporting. And then under each of those 4 categories, you need to report the total amount expended for salaries, for benefits, for purchase professional and technical services, for properties, other purchase services, everything on the list here, debt services, and other items. So for each of those, you'll be reporting in those areas. And then on the next slide, this is additional information LEAs are going to have to report for ESSER 1, 2, and 3. So any additional allowable uses and to address learning loss, the planned uses by each category by percentage, whether or not ESSER funds were used for internet access, re-engaging students, allocation of resources, and addressing learning loss. Some of these are going to be a yes, no, and some of these you're going to have to actually report on. Then the number of full-time equivalent positions, regardless of the funding source, and then whether or not ESSER funds have been spent on the items listed on the slide on the right-hand side. So again, this is going to be yes or no. Did you use the funds for those activities? New this year on the next slide is an additional requirement. So added to the report is the use of ESSER funds for activities under the Expanded Opportunities Learning Grant. So you can see you'll be asked to report the total amount expended during the reporting period from each of those funding sources, and then yes and no if if the expenditures were used for any of those 4 items listed there. And then any planned uses for other categories. So in addition to that, there is reporting on gear. And you remember gear came through the Governor's Budget Act, and it did have some specified purposes. So for gear funds, LEAs are going to have to report on whether or not the funds were used for purchasing educational technology, if they were used for activities focused on addressing the needs of low-income students, students with disability, English learners, racial ethnic minorities, foster youth, and students experiencing homelessness. And also, were they used for providing mental health services and supports, for sanitation and minimizing the spread of disease, and for extended learning opportunities. And then there's a category for other. So again, reporting also on gear funds used for the ELOG grant. So that's Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant, right? And additional gear reporting, again, gear 1 and 2. So you can see the scope of this. When we were putting this together, the question was, are we doing this for you to memorize this or just to scare you? Well, maybe for the first part is just to scare you, maybe just, but to remind you that if you are in the program side and you have a piece in this, because often these go through fiscal offices and they need to know how were the funds used, and you're the people who know what actually happened. And why is that important? Well, because when you come to an audit, someone's going to look at this and say, really, you used it for that? Or how did you use it? And you're the person who has the answer to those questions. So really important that your fiscal people work with you closely when you're doing this reporting, so it's accurate and actually reflects the appropriate use of funds. So for gear, additionally, LEAs are going to have to report on the planned use of funds by category and by percentage for all the areas listed on the slide. And they'll also need to provide a report if the funding was used to provide home internet access, mobile hotspots, devices, internet subscriptions for students, or during the reporting period. And another item that is included is how many non-public schools and public schools received gear funding during that reporting period. So if any of those funds were used during that period for non-public schools, that needs to be included on that page too. There is help out there for you, and you should have received an email with this information recently that CDE will be providing a walkthrough and technical assistance webinar to review the reporting requirements. It's going to be Thursday, March 2nd from 10 to 11, and there's a link here for registration. So I would really encourage you to participate in that webinar, especially if you're the one reporting and doing the actual reporting. But just again, a reminder that if you are implementing programs, you want to make sure what's reported is accurate and clearly reflects what the district is doing, so you have backup documentation. You don't want someone inputting something saying that you did something and then you're asked for documentation and don't have it because that was not accurate. So that I would say is an important piece for you to keep in mind there. So the technical assistance webinar, they always do a great job. So make sure you attend that. All right, so that's the first thing on your plate, I guess. The next one is a good news slide. And that's because we've been getting questions and we've been hearing a confusion about a mid-year LCAP report. And so we wanted to make sure everyone was really clear, and we wanted to say it out loud in red, bold. There is no requirement for a mid-year LCAP report this year for the 22-23 school year. So that is one you can check off your list. That is not required. But there's a lot of good reason why this is confusing, and that's because both past and future. In the past, last year, as you recall, there was a mid-year supplement required. And the reason for that was because there was increased funding that came out after the LCAPs were submitted, but most important was additional legislation that generated funding for LEAs with over 55% unduplicated pupils, and that was that 15% add-on money. That came on after the LCAP was submitted. So there was no way that your board could be aware of, or, until after the fact, that funding was there. So this was put out there as a requirement. So boards and the public were aware of that requirement and what you were doing with those funds and the additional other funds that were coming. So that was a one-time sort of blip for last year. But the other reason it's confusing is because there is a current language in the budget trailer bill that is out that includes a proposal for a mid-year update to the LCAP annually each year by February 28th. And what I think has happened is people have heard this and they panicked and then went back to the office, and it's like playing telephone. It went through the office that there's a report due. No, this is a proposal only at this time. It is not in legislation. And if enacted, it wouldn't be effective until February of 2024. So one thing you can relax on, there it is in black and white. No report, mid-year report this year. All right, and finally, the consolidated application, the mysterious CONAP. Where is it? Well, finally, we got a word from CDE recently in a meeting. They shared that they don't anticipate it's going to be released. The winter submission, this is for the 22-23 CONAP. They don't anticipate it will be released until April of this year. And that's due to internal changes they're making. And we discussed that it's about federal transferability primarily, or where the changes are. So, but it seems to be creating a lot of challenges for them up there and delaying the release of it. The bad news for you may be that when asked about the submission timeline, they indicated that the typical 6-week timeline you get, usually it's supposed to be released January 15th due the 28th of February. So they typically, if they delay it, they always give you that 6 weeks. They said that may not be the case this year. So you may have a short timeline for submission because they're bumping into the spring submission then. So be prepared for that. So based on that, we just wanted to just kind of give you a heads up on a few things that you might be able to do in the meantime. Oh, by the way, before we go there, let's back up just a second, just to let you know, CDE has indicated they will be providing webinars to support you with the submission. I know specifically the private school office regarding Title I, they're going to be doing some webinars. It looks like it may be program by program, but we're hearing that they will be doing some support, which hasn't been there in the past. So that is very good news. So what you need to do, first of all, is be on the listserv. So that's a link to sign up for the listserv. You'll get notified about the release, As soon as it's out, you'll get notified about any upcoming trainings that are coming. So that's number one to do. Number two is make sure your password is current. And as you recall, that's your CAS, centralized authenticating system, is the same as your car's password. Double check it, make sure it's working, so you're ready to go and can start submitting when it comes out. And then you also want to connect with people in your office who provide you with the data for it and this report, and make sure they're ready to provide you with the required data. So let's look at what that data is that you might be able to get ready for. All right, so first of all is Title III. All right, and as you know, Title III has more frequent reporting requirements due to the U.S. Department of Education's oversight of CDE. So they've required them to collect more frequent expenditure reports. So what you're going to be looking at, and this covers both English learner and immigrant programs. So you might want to talk with your fiscal people, whoever does those, and make sure that they're prepared to report on your English learner 6 months report. That'd be for 22-23. So that is current year funds. So they're looking, that typically goes through December 30th, from July 1 to December 30th. There'll be an 18-month report, and that's for 21-22 funds. And then finally a 27-month report, and that's typically a closeout report because 27 months is when those programs end. So a lot of reporting for Title III. So you might give your Title III fiscal person a heads up on that. The other thing to keep in mind is Title I. You'll have a closeout report, a 27-month closeout report. That's 2021 funds. And then the other thing that is going to be important to you is the 21-22. That's last year's 15-month carryover report. So as you recall, Title I has a requirement that you spend 85% of the funds in the first year. It's 15 months because of the federal fiscal year. So that's from July 1 of 2021 to September 30th of 2022. So you need to, first of all, make sure that you have expended those, at least 85% of those funds, or be prepared to submit a waiver. The waiver will be included in the WinterCon app. So that's where you request the waiver. And remember, it's an after the fact waiver. So you want to make sure that you get that waiver approved if you're eligible. So number one for Title I, make sure all your 2021 funds were obligated by last September 30th and liquidated within 120 days. That money needs to be out the door. So if it's not, you'll get a bill from CDE. Secondly, you want to determine if you've spent 85% of your 21-22 funds, were they obligated by September 30th of last year, and were they liquidated, that 85% within the time period? If not, you want to make sure that you have that you're eligible for a waiver. So that would be, have you had a waiver in the last 3 years? And if not, then you would be eligible for a waiver. What you will want to do is to go to the CDE waiver page, and they've developed a website just for reviewing waiver criteria. And because in the last few years, the CDE's gotten a little bit more particular about reviewing those waivers, and they typically in the past, they kind of went through easily, but we've had a lot of them that came back for revision. So look at that page and see what they're asking for in the waiver, and make sure you've met all those requirements and are ready to write it. So you can do that easily. So those are some things you can do on the fiscal end to get ready. Next is what else? Allocations and reservations. You're also, for your Title I for this year, they're going to ask you for your reservation amount. How much did you reserve for parent engagement? Remember, you have legislative requirements on those. Your homeless reservation, if you have neglected and delinquent, then you need to reserve for them. And then also your equitable share for private schools. And if you reserve funds for any other purposes for district operated services at Title I schools. So you need to be prepared to report all that. So you should know now What did you reserve? How much for which of those programs? And then finally, a big one, and we're getting a lot of calls more than usual about this, and that is the winter consolidated application is where you report your school allocations for Title I. So you're going to be asked on there to report. This is not when you do your allocations. We say that so many times because that's so important, that you should be allocating funds to schools at the beginning of the year so they can operate programs. You report it in the WinterCon app. This year, it's kind of waking people up because it's so late. So what you need to do is make sure you're communicating with your fiscal office. If they do those, if they complete those reports, they need to know how you ranked your schools. So did you rank them by grade span? Did you rank them district-wide? Okay. Did you vary the per pupil amounts? And if so, how was that? How did you do that? Do you have many schools that are eligible and being served that are under 35% poverty? And if so, keep in mind that 125% rule is going to be applied. So you should have already done this and have that ready to give your fiscal people. Here's the schools that we identified. Here's how we did it. And that should be ready to pop into the Con app. Should not be ranking your schools now. You should be reporting on how they were ranked. So really important. And just one reason for that, among many, and we get calls from districts who I'm not sure put the money out to schools or didn't put it out, but they went to rank their schools. They've been serving schools all year, but they didn't do the official ranking. And when they applied the ranking rules, they found they had been serving schools that were not eligible. So that's a big oops. What do you do then? You put money out to schools and you spend it without legal authority. So we don't want that to happen to you. So, but be prepared and make sure you've got that ready to put in, because your school allocation is probably one of the more challenging parts of this reporting. And then finally, I think, was equitable services. And the key there is your low income student counts for your private schools. Keep in mind your funding for private school services is based for Title I is based on the number of low income students who reside in your public school attendance area and attend a participating private school. So you should have that data available, because that's how you determine how much is reserved for private school services for this year. That data is to be a part of consultation. So you should have documentation that you consulted with the private school. How are you going to collect poverty data? What are you going to use? You should be using the same data as you're using for your public schools, if that's available. So if they have free and reduced meal data, that's what you should use. If not, you need to consult about it. You can use a survey, extrapolation. How are you going to get reasonably accurate poverty data? You also want to make sure you have a written affirmation on file for all your participating schools, because you're going to have to document that in the Con app. So those are just a few things that you might be able to start now, so you're ready to complete that as soon as it comes out, if we do have a very short turnaround. All right, and now I think we're going to hear more about equitable services from Rachel. Rachel?
Thank you, Bonnie. Good morning, everyone. So in this next section, we just wanted to provide a brief refresher on equitable services and the consultation process, as districts are now beginning this process for the 2023-24 services. Next slide, please. So ESSA requires that access to equitable services be offered to eligible private school students, their families, teachers, and other educational personnel. However, participation by private schools is not required. Services provided must be allowable and comparable to those services provided to public school students and teachers participating in the program. Now, the services can be different from those services provided to public school participants, because the services must be based on the needs of private school students and teachers. And services provided must also be evaluated for effectiveness. It's also important to note that any services provided must be secular, neutral, and non-ideological. And also, services must supplement and in no case supplant the basic level of services that the private school is responsible for providing to their students, staff, and parents. Additionally, funds may not be provided directly to a private school. So this slide highlights the federal programs that equitable services requirements apply to. And so you can see that this includes Title I, Parts A and C, Title II, Part A, Title III, Part A, Title IV, Parts A and B, and also Project Serve. And although not listed on the slide, you may remember that equitable services provisions also applied to the first round of ESSER and GEAR funds through the CARES Act. So another important thing to remember is that funds must be obligated in the fiscal year that funds are received, so that eligible private school students, teachers, other educational personnel, and families receive the services that they are entitled to in a timely manner. The school district is responsible for retaining the control of funds for equitable services. This means that materials, equipment, and property purchased with funds for equitable services belongs to the district and must be included on the district inventory. Materials or equipment purchased for equitable services are for use during that fiscal year and should also be collected at the end of the year. Now, if the private school wants to use the materials or equipment again the following year, then that's something that must be determined during consultation based on the needs of the students. Additionally, any materials or equipment must be purchased directly by the school district and received by a district employee. So private school officials may not sign for the delivery of materials. Equitable services must also be provided by either an employee of the school district or through a third-party contractor. And the employment or contract must be under the control and supervision of the school district. So this means that all contracts must be negotiated and agreed to by the school district. So private school officials should never be the one to sign a contract with a third-party contractor. Next slide, please. Only private schools that are nonprofit and have submitted an affidavit to the CDE may participate in equitable services. So there are a few ways to access the list of eligible private schools. The first link that you see on the slide will take you to the CDE website where you can access a list of all private schools with an affidavit on file. And the second link is a searchable database that allows a search by district for the private schools located within the district boundaries. A county password is required to access this database, and we've included the password for LA County on the slide. Other counties must contact the CDE private school office for their specific county password. And one important thing to keep in mind is that the CDE does not verify the accuracy of information on the affidavits. The CDE expects school districts to verify the accuracy of student enrollment data and tax-exempt status through the consultation process. And this expectation is noted on the CONAP nonprofit private school consultation page that gets submitted in the spring release. Now, in terms of private school participation, the requirements for Title I Part A are different than that of the other title programs. So for Title I Part A, nonprofit private schools, both within and outside of the district boundaries, may be eligible to participate. And that's because funding and services are based on the student's residence in a Title I school attendance area. So for example, if you have low-income students who live in Title I school attendance areas in your district, but they attend nonprofit private schools outside of your district boundaries, these students would generate funds for Title I services. It's also important to remember that poverty does not determine who actually receives Title I services. To be eligible for Title I services, private school students must live in a Title I school attendance area and be failing or most at risk of failing based on multiple educationally related criteria that's agreed upon during the consultation process. For Title I, Part C, and also Titles 2, 3, and 4, only nonprofit private schools within the district boundaries may participate. Now, it's important to note that consultation with nonprofit private schools is the responsibility of the school district. So it's up to the district to initiate contact with private schools on an annual basis. So the first step in this process is identifying eligible private schools, which was discussed on the previous 2 slides. You must then contact the schools to make them aware of the programs and services for which their students and staff may be eligible. And again, for Title I, Part C, and Titles 2, 3, and 4, you would initiate contact with private schools within your district boundaries. And for Title I, Part A, you would contact private schools within your district boundaries, as well as private schools in adjoining districts to determine if they have eligible students enrolled. Most districts use an intent to participate letter to make that initial contact with private schools. And then the next step involves ongoing discussions and meetings with private school officials on key topics related to the provision of equitable services. And really the goal of consultation is agreement between the district and private school officials on how to provide equitable and effective programs and services for private school students, their families, and teachers. And then the results of this agreement are reported to the Ombudsman through the spring CONAP submission, which is typically due in June. And we've included a screenshot of the related CONAP page in a later section in this presentation. Next slide, please. So in order to ensure that consultation with private school officials is timely and meaningful, it must begin early enough to prepare for the next school year. And so it's recommended that this process start in February. So consultation must occur during the design and the development of programs, and before the district makes any decision that can impact the participation of private school students, teachers, other educational personnel, and families. And consultation must also be ongoing throughout the year in order to ensure effective implementation and also the evaluation of services. So here on this slide, you can see some of the specific topics that must be addressed during the consultation process. And so this includes how the needs of private school students and teachers will be identified, what services will be offered, and also how the services will be assessed. Now, it's important to keep in mind that a unilateral offer of services by a school district without the opportunity for discussion is not considered adequate consultation. The consultation process must provide an opportunity for private school officials to express their views and then to have those views considered. So districts must maintain documentation that verifies that it has met the requirement for timely and meaningful consultation and that it has provided equitable services. So some of this documentation includes intent to participate letters, written affirmation of consultation, and then also evidence of consultation attempts. And you'll want to ensure that you maintain documentation of outreach to private schools. So for example, anything mailed should be sent via certified mail, and then anything emailed should be sent with read receipts. Other documentation that should be maintained includes meeting agendas and minutes, any data that's collected to assess or evaluate services, any service agreements or contracts with third-party vendors, and monitoring and assessment tools. Also, inventory list for materials or equipment purchased, and then the identification criteria that's used for student eligibility for Title I services. And then if the district disagrees with private school officials on any topic discussed during consultation, the district is required to provide in writing to the private school officials the reasons why it disagrees. So you would need to maintain any written explanations of disagreement if that exists. Next slide. So here we see some screenshots of the CDE's intent to participate and written affirmation templates, as well as a link to access these sample templates. Now, most districts use some sort of intent to participate form to make that initial contact with private schools. And it's important to obtain a copy of the intent to participate form from each private school, whether or not they intend to participate in equitable services. And you'll also want to include a deadline by which they need to respond. You would then begin the consultation process with private schools that have indicated their intent to participate. Districts are also required to maintain in its records a written affirmation signed by each nonprofit private school to document that timely and meaningful consultation has occurred. And so private school officials must have the option to indicate their belief that timely and meaningful consultation has not occurred, or that the program design for private school participants is not equitable. So this needs to be included on the written affirmation form. And this information is also reported to the CDE through the nonprofit private school consultation page with the spring CONAP submission. So here is just a sample private school consultation timeline that has been adapted from a sample CDE timeline. And we've included the link at the bottom of the slide for the CDE sample for reference. And so as previously mentioned, it's recommended that districts begin the consultation process for next year's services in February to ensure that services begin in a timely manner. And then on this sample consultation timeline, you'll notice that at certain times during the year, districts are consulting with private school officials on both the current year programs and services, as well as the next year's programs and services. So here we see a screenshot of the nonprofit private school consultation page from last year's spring CONAP. And so you can see here that LEAs were asked to indicate for each nonprofit private school if consultation occurred, if consultation agreement was met, if there's a signed written affirmation on file, and then also to provide a consultation code indicating the private school's belief that timely and meaningful consultation has or has not occurred, or if the program design is not equitable. So this is just something important to keep in mind as you're beginning the consultation process with private schools for programs and services for next year, because you'll be reporting this information to the CDE through the spring CONAP submission. And so here we've just included several links to some CDE resources, which includes the Ombudsman webpage, and then some FAQs for Title I, Title II, and Title III equitable services, and then also a link to the non-regulatory guidance from the U.S. Department of Ed. And then lastly, we just wanted to share that, as mentioned earlier, that we're offering an equitable services workshop, and it's on March 9th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. And so during this workshop, we'll be going more in depth on equitable services requirements, including specific requirements for Titles 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the registration link is included on the slide for those interested. And that concludes my section, so I will now turn it over to Helen for an update on CSI.
Thank you, Rachel. Today, we will review the key elements of Comprehensive Support and Improvement, CSI, and provide you information on DOS school flexibility and go over additional targeted support and improvement, or ATSI. So let's begin with the purpose of CSI. The purpose of CSI funding is to provide resources and assistance to LEAs to improve student outcomes in schools that meet the criteria for CSI. The Every Student Succeeds Act requires that the state educational agencies determine school eligibility for comprehensive support and improvement. And remember that as a condition of funding, the LEAs must collaborate with educational partners to develop and implement a 23-24 CSI plan for the school to improve student outcomes. The link to SS School Assistance Eligibility for CSI and ATSI is included in the slide. In accordance with ESSA, schools are eligible for Comprehensive Support and Improvement, CSI, when they meet the criteria in one of the following two categories: CSI low graduation rate or CSI low performing. In California, we use data from the California School Dashboard to determine which schools are eligible for CSI. For 2022, the CSI low graduation rate consists of schools that have 3-year graduation rate that is below 68%. This graduation rate applies to both Title I funded schools and schools that did not receive Title I funds. In addition, schools must have graduation rate data for 2020, 2021, and 2022 to be eligible for support in this category. For 2022, the CSI low performing, it consists of schools that receive Title I funding for this 21-22 school year and are the lowest performing based on the 22 dashboard data, and must meet one of the eligibility criteria, which are schools with all indicators at the lowest status level, or schools with all indicators at the lowest status level, but one indicator at another status level. So if a school is among the lowest performing 5% of Title I funded schools, they become eligible for CSI. Schools will only be eligible in one category for any given school year, and the link to the 22 dashboard technical guide for SS school support is on this slide. And please note that the school eligibility categories are hierarchical. First, eligibility is determined for CSI low graduation rate schools. Schools eligible for CSI based on graduation rate and are also Title I funded schools are removed from the pool prior to the determination of Title I funded schools in the CSI lowest performing schools category. Again, schools can only be eligible for one category of CSI in any given school year. All LEAs for CSI, regardless of their intent to apply for SSCSI funds or not, are required to develop and implement a CSI plan to improve student outcomes for each school identified for CSI. CSI planning is a federal requirement established in the Educational Code 64001A, and there's one exception to the CSI planning requirement for DOS schools, and we will discuss that later in this presentation. And remember that LEAs must collaborate with educational partners to develop and implement a CSI plan. So first off, LEAs must collaborate with educational partners to develop and implement a CSI plan. The CSI plan must be informed by all state indicators, including student performance against state-determined long-term goals. To do this, start with California School Dashboard to understand how the school became eligible for CSI. The dashboard will inform you about the specific indicators that contributed to your school's eligibility. And this is a great starting point to then gather school level data to analyze and potentially identify the trends that led to eligibility and help prioritize specific focus areas in the CSI plan. Next, the CSI plan must be based on school level needs assessment. Review the data and the needs of the school to assess the reasons why your school became eligible for CSI. The needs assessment can include a review of quantitative and qualitative data analysis, such as empathy interviews and observations. The needs assessment should eventually lead to a root cause analysis to determine the underlying causes of the challenges that led to CSI eligibility. And a thorough needs assessment will inform challenges faced by the school and the strength and the assets of the school so that the strength can be tapped into or built upon to improve student and school outcomes. The CSI plan must include evidence-based interventions, strategies and activities that could be employed to address those needs. Evidence-based interventions are those practices and programs that have evidence to show that they are actually effective at producing results and improving student achievement outcomes. Evidence-based interventions for CSIs are required to have strong, moderate, or promising evidence to support them. The CSI plan must also identify resource inequities and address those inequities through implementation of the plan, which may include a review of LEA and school level budgeting. So when doing this, CSI planning team could ask a question such as, is there something more that the school needs in order to improve student outcomes beyond what's provided to all schools? So CSI plans for 23 and 24 school year must be also developed and approved at the local level and should be ready to be implemented no later than the first day of the 23-24 school year. This will ensure that students and the school receive a full year of implementation, intervention and support consistent with the LEA CSI plan for that school. In the next few slides, I will discuss the dashboard alternative school status flexibility for CSI, known as DAS. So what is dashboard alternative status school or DAS school? So DAS schools are California alternative schools, and they serve the highest risk students in settings such as continuation schools, community day schools, or juvenile court schools. At the September 2022 State Board meeting, changes and flexibilities were approved for DAS schools eligible for CSI. DAS schools that meet eligibility criteria for CSI low graduation rate or CSI low performing will be referred to as DAS Community of Practice or COP schools. DAS schools can be eligible for CSI and ATSI, and more information on the eligibility criteria can also be found in the link on this slide. So what does this mean for DAS schools? So LEAs with DAS COP schools identified under CSI low graduation rate criteria with less than 100 students enrolled has the option to forego the implementation of all CSI related improvement activities. For LEAs that exercise this flexibility, they do not have to develop or implement a CSI plan for its DAS COP schools for the CSI low graduation rate criteria. They will forego the CSI funding associated with that school. LEAs are strongly encouraged to collaborate with educational partners when making this decision. And for transparency, LEAs that exercise this flexibility are required to add the standardized language to prompt 1 of the CSI section of the LCAP plan summary as highlighted in yellow on this slide. So based on SS section 111D1CI, any LEAs with DAS COP school identified under CSI low graduation rate criteria, regardless of the number of students enrolled, has the option to use its LCAP to meet its CSI planning requirements. For LEAs that choose this option, they must ensure that it addresses each of the CSI planning requirements, as previously shared in the presentation, within the LCAP. The LEA has the flexibility in determining how best to address each of these CSI plan requirements within the LCAP. To support LEA's school planning efforts for single school districts, charter schools, and LEAs with DAS COP schools eligible under the CSI low graduation criteria, graduation rate criteria, the CDE has developed a CSI planning summary that explains how to use the LCAP to meet the CSI planning requirements. Additionally, LEAs with schools that meet the criteria for CSI will continue to complete the CSI prompts located in the plan summary of the LCAP as applicable. More information on this can be found on the DAS COP tab, and the link is included on this slide. And now I will turn it over to Anita to continue with this section.
Hi, everyone. You are with me for the next 10 slides. So once again, funding is available to LEAs with schools identified for CSI. Now, please note that the application for funding window is now open, available through GMART, and it closes on March 3rd at 4 p.m. That's 1 week from tomorrow. And as part of the application, all LEAs eligible for CSI funding will be asked to select whether or not they intend to apply for CSI funds. So regardless of whether an LEA chooses to apply for funds or not, the LEA must still meet its statutory obligation to meet all CSI planning requirements of ESSA. Now, new to the application is the option for eligible LEAs to note whether or not they intend to forego CSI funding and planning requirements, but only for the DOS COP eligible schools with CSI low grad rate and less than 100 enrolled students. The information provided with an LEA's intent to apply for funding will help determine final allocations of CSI funding to all eligible LEAs. Once the deadline closes, LEAs will no longer have the opportunity to revise the information it provided. So please, please, please ensure that your LEA's decision to decline funding is absolute and reflects the opinion and intent of your leadership. The CDE will not be able to modify any submissions after 4 p.m. on March 3rd. There are allowable uses of CSI funds. The purpose of the funds is to provide resources and assistance to LEAs to improve student outcomes in schools that meet the criteria for CSI. Funds can only be spent on evidence-based intervention strategies or activities that are directly related to CSI improvement planning, development, and implementation efforts. The following list here provides some examples of allowable uses: building capacity for staff, collaborating with educational partners, conducting needs assessments and root cause analysis, selecting and implementing evidence-based interventions, using data and outcomes to monitor and evaluate improvement efforts, reviewing, identifying, and addressing resource inequities. There are many ways we can analyze resource inequities, and as a reference, consider visiting the Alliance for Resource Equity website to learn more about how best to identify equity opportunities and how to build shared plans to improve student experiences and outcomes. The link to the website is provided on this slide. Under ESSA, CSI plans are required to be evidence-based, and as defined by the Every Student Succeeds Act, evidence-based interventions are practices or programs that have evidence to show that they are effective at producing results and improving outcomes when implemented. The kind of evidence described in ESSA has generally been produced through formal studies and research. Under ESSA, there are 4 tiers or levels as you see here. Tier 1, strong evidence. Tier 2, moderate evidence. Tier 3, promising evidence. And Tier 4, demonstrates a rationale. Interventions applied under Title I, Section 1003, School Improvement, are required to have strong, moderate, or promising evidence to support them. That would be Tier 1, 2, and 3. Additional guidance and information is available on the link provided at the bottom of this slide. Now, continuing through the federal accountability system, we have targeted support and improvement, TSI, and additional targeted support and improvement, ATSI. Schools that were not identified for CSI low grad rate or CSI low performing are eligible for TSI or ATSI. Due to a lapse in available state indicator data for the past couple of years because of the COVID-19 pandemic, TSI eligibility will not be determined until 2024-25 school year when the 2024 dashboard is published. TSI identification requires 2 consecutive years of data for student groups. We do not have 2 consecutive years of data at this time. And so the student group performance data that will be used for TSI determination will be from this year, 22-23, and the 23-24 school years, no schools in California are in TSI status at this time. Nevertheless, this year, ATSI status is determined and will be determined again next year. ATSI identification is based on 1 year's performance data for one or more student groups as reported on the dashboard. ATSI determinations are made at the student group level. The student groups used for ATSI determinations are the following: race or ethnicity. To the right of the arrow, you'll find the specific subgroups: English learners, students with disabilities, socioeconomically disadvantaged students, students experiencing homelessness, and foster youth complete the list of student groups. The number size is important to note as well. An N size of 30 or more for all student groups, with the exception of students experiencing homelessness and foster youth, is significant. An N size of 15 or more is significant for foster youth and students experiencing homelessness group. So what makes a school eligible for ATSI? First, keep in mind that eligibility is based on student group performance across multiple indicators on the California dashboard. Both Title I and non-Title I schools are eligible so long as they haven't been identified as a CSI low grad rate or CSI low performing school. In 2021-22, with data from 2019, there were about 176 schools identified in ATSI in LA County. Fast forward to today, using the 2022 dashboard data, there are 1,392 schools identified in ATSI in LA County. If you're quick at math, that's about a 790% increase. With numbers like these, it is important that we understand the criteria used for identification. ATSI identification in 22-23 is based on only 1 year of dashboard results. Schools are identified.
Purchases.
Schools are identified as ATSI if one or more student groups meet one of the following 2 criteria. Either all indicators on the dashboard are at the lowest level, or all but one indicator is at the lowest status level. Please note that there may be indicators that do not have a qualifying N size to showcase a status level. This is because the number of students in the group are less than 30 or 15, depending on the specific student group. If an indicator does not show a status level, it is not taken into consideration when applying the ATSI criteria. So let's take a closer look at these 2 examples. With student group X, all 5 state indicators received a status level. Furthermore, all indicators came in at the lowest status level. This school is identified as ATSI for student group X. Now looking at the next example. With student group Y, all indicators received a status level, and all but one are at the lowest status level. This school is also identified as ATSI for student group Y. It is possible for a school to be identified ATSI for more than 1 student group. So now that we know that our LEA has 1 or more schools identified for ATSI, what happens next? These are the requirements for LEAs who have schools in ATSI status. Once the LEA has received notification by the state, and we all have, these are the steps that must be taken. First, the LEA must notify the school of their status and inform them which student group or groups are underperforming. Next, the LEA will approve and monitor the implementation of the school's plan. If after a number of years, the LEA determines that the implementation of the school's plan is unsuccessful, then additional action is taken by the LEA. Also important to note that unlike CSI, there is no additional funding provided to LEAs for TSI or ATSI, for ATSI schools. So now that the school is aware of their status, now what's next? Upon notification of ATSI status by the LEA, the school is required to collaborate with educational partners to develop and implement a school-level plan to improve outcomes. Federal requirements, planning requirements established in Ed Code Section 64001 allow the SIPSA, the School Plan for Student Achievement, to meet ESSA requirements for ATSI planning. It also allows single school districts and charter schools to utilize the LCAP to serve as the SIPSA so long as it meets ESSA planning and educational partner requirements. The school plan must adhere to the following: be based and informed by all indicators on the California dashboard, include evidence-based interventions from tier 1, 2, or 3, as previously mentioned, and identify resource inequities at the school and LEA level. We understand that this is a lot to process at one time or in just one sitting. And in an effort to provide a more comprehensive look at CSI, TSI, and ATSI, we are offering a training in 3 weeks to delve in deeper with the ins and outs of CSI and ATSI. Save the date. The workshop will take place on Thursday, March 16th from 3 to 4:30. This webinar is open to both district level and school level administrators. A flyer will be sent out shortly on the link to register. You can also use the link on this slide to register today if you'd like. Thank you all for your attention. And now Adrienne will provide you with an FPM update.
Thank you, Anita. Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to focus on the FPM update on the School Support and Improvement FPM instrument. The School Support and Improvement Program instrument is often referred to as the SSI FPM instrument. And the SSI instrument covers the reviews of schools identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. There are 6 items in the SSI instrument. SSI 1 reviews the school site's activities for all schools that have been identified for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. Items SSI 2 through 6 applies only to LEAs who have accepted the CSI funds. The items for review for the CSI funds are basically the same fiscal items that are reviewed for the other federal programs. They are allocations and reporting, allowable use of funds, supplement not supplant, LEA administrative charges, time and effort, and lastly, LEA equipment inventory. Let's take a closer look at SSI 1, school site activities. Within this, there are 6 different components to item 1 in school site activities. 1.0 pertains to schools in CSI. It requires the LEA for each CSI school to locally develop and implement a CSI plan for the school to improve student outcomes. This must be done in partnership with the educational partners, which is the principal, other school leaders, teachers, parents, and family members. The CSI plan must be informed, as Anita and Helen shared earlier, must be informed by all indicators, include evidence-based interventions, be based on a school-level assessment, identify resource inequities, and be approved by the school, LEA, and state educational agency, which the state has given this responsibility to county offices. 1.1 and 1.2 are for schools identified for TSI. Although currently there are no schools identified for TSI, you need to know the requirements for TSI, because if your school is identified for ATSI, the requirements of ATSI are added to the TSI requirements. So 1.1 refers to the requirement that the LEA must formally notify the schools that they have been identified for TSI, and this notification must include the student subgroups that are consistently underperforming or have identified them for TSI. 1.2 requires the TSI school to develop and implement a school-level TSI plan in partnership with their educational partners. The TSI plan must be informed by all indicators, including student performance amongst the long-term goals, include evidence-based interventions, be approved by the LEA prior to implementation, and be monitored by the LEA. 1.3 addresses ATSI schools. If you have schools that have been identified for ATSI, the LEA must also formally notify the schools that they have been identified for ATSI, with the inclusion of the student subgroups that are consistently underperforming. Component A here states that the ATSI school must develop an ATSI plan that includes all the requirements that are from TSI, with the additional required inclusion of identifying resource inequities. So the ATSI plan must be informed by all indicators, including student performance against long-term goals, include evidence-based interventions. It must also identify resource inequities, be approved by the LEA prior to implementation, and be monitored by the LEA. 1.4 applies to CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools. And if the school has an SPSA, then it may serve as the school improvement plan, as long as the SIPSA meets all of the federal requirements. And as mentioned earlier, it also allows single site school districts and charter schools to use their LCAP as their SPSA, provided that the LCAP meets the federal school planning requirements and that the educational partner requirements are followed and is adopted at a public hearing. So now during an FPM review, the requested evidence for the school site activities are a copy of the LEA notification to schools for TSI and ATSI, a copy of the school improvement plan for CSI, TSI, and ATSI. And again, this could be the SIPSA, the LCAP for single school site districts or charter schools, or actually a separate plan that includes the federal school improvement plan requirements. And the last requested evidence is documentation showing the involvement of your educational partners in this process of developing the plan, such as records of agendas, minutes, meetings, attendance sign-in sheets, etc. Now, the next 5 slides are required for LEAs who accepted ESSA CSI funds. If you are not new to CSI or ATSI, then you're probably very familiar with these items. But if you are new to the whole world of CSI or ATSI, we will go in depth on the FPM fiscal items during our CSI ATSI workshop on March 16th. So these next slides are just here for your reference. The fiscal review is basically the same as it is for any federal program, as you will see. So we have the evidence requests for the review of allowable use of funds, such as the duty statements, the general ledger, the position control report, the school improvement plan for the CSI, TSI, ATSI, and lastly, the time and effort records. And this would go for SSI 3, and also I skipped the other one, which was SSI 2, which is allocations and reporting. And for this, the evidence that's requested is a detailed general ledger of the CSI resource codes being used. And the allowable use of funds. Again, this is to determine whether the expenditures are reasonable, necessary, and allocable, and that they're used for the development of strategies to improve public pupil and performance only at the CSI schools, and that these strategies are indeed aligned to your LCAP. It's also noted that the CSI funds cannot be used to hire additional permanent staff. And again, this is the evidence that's requested for SSI 3, which is the allowable use of funds. SSI 4 is looking and reviewing the supplement, not supplant, with these CSI funds. And the requested evidence will be a narrative and or a table that includes the formula showing a system of methods that was used to determine and allocate state and local funds to schools. And you also must include a sample of how these methods were applied to the fiscal year that is being reviewed. SSI 5 reviews the LEA administrative charges specifically with time and effort. The requested evidence for SSI 5 is the duty statements, the position control report, the time and effort policy and procedures that you have in place. And lastly, any CSI funded time and effort records of personnel activity reports, semi-annual certifications, timesheets, and time cards. The last item reviewed is SSI 6, which is the equipment inventory. And the evidence requested for SSI 6 is the approval capital expenditure form showing the approval by CDE for any unit cost of $5,000 or more, as well as all the equipment inventory records that you have in terms of historical list, the records of your physical check, and again, the approval of your equipment disposal form if you're disposing of any equipment. And in our upcoming CSI ATSI workshop, we will be going over, in addition to more in depth what these items are being requested, we're going to go over the most common findings during an FPM review and the resolutions that were given by CDE to the districts. So again, we want to encourage you to come to our webinar on March 16th. And now Jeannie will go over the LCAP update.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. The LCAP update section this morning addresses required goals in the LCAP and requirements for LEAs supporting schools eligible for comprehensive support and improvement. If you can go on to the next slide, thank you. I will start with the required goals. Per statute, specific LEAs must include required goals in their LCAP to address consistently low-performing student groups or low-performing schools based on eligibility determined through the California Schools Dashboard data. Eligible LEAs need to include a goal that describes how they are addressing the needs of consistently low-performing student groups or how they are addressing the needs of low-performing schools within the LEA. Per statute, the instructions in the LCAP template were revised last year to indicate that LEAs that meet the criteria to receive differentiated assistance based on the performance of the same pupil group or student groups for 3 or more consecutive years shall include a goal in the local control and accountability plan. This goal shall focus on improving the performance of the consistently low-performing pupil group or groups. The list of LEAs that must include required goals based on consistently low performance of the student group or groups on the dashboard is linked in the LCAP instructions and posted on CDE's LCFF webpage. The list identifies eligible LEAs and the applicable student group or groups that must be addressed in the goals. More LEAs were identified for required goals based on student performance in this second year of the requirement. And next, we'll take a look at the requirements for the goals addressing consistently low-performing student groups. Here you see for the goal description, LEAs need to describe the outcomes the LEA plans to achieve to address the needs of and improve outcomes for eligible student groups. The LEA must also explain why they are required to develop the goal. In this description, the LEA needs to identify the student groups that the goal is required to address, how the actions and related metrics in this goal differ from previous efforts to improve outcomes for the eligible student groups, and why the LEA believes the actions, metrics, and expenditures will achieve the outcomes identified in the goal description. This goal needs to include metrics, outcomes, actions, and expenditures specific to address the needs of and improving outcomes for the eligible student groups. In the case that an LEA is required to address multiple student groups, it does not have to develop a goal to address each student group separately. However, each student group must be specifically addressed in the goal. And next, we'll go on to the consistently low performing schools criteria. Per statute, the low performing school criteria applies to districts or county offices with 2 or more schools, based on 2 years of dashboard data. There are 2 components in this criteria. First, LEAs with 1 or more schools that received the 2 lowest performance levels on all but one of the reported state indicators. And second, the performance in the all student group for the LEA is at least 1 performance level higher in all of those indicators. So this is a combination of low performance at the school level and comparing school level performance for all students to the LEA level performance for all students. This list of LEAs eligible for required goals based on consistently low performing schools criteria is linked in the LCAP instructions and posted on the CDE's LCFF webpage. The list identifies eligible LEAs and the eligible schools. And now we'll take a look at the criteria. This slide provides the requirements for the goal addressing consistently low performing schools. Here, for the goal description, LEAs need to describe the outcomes the LEA plans to achieve to address the disparities in performance between the students enrolled at the low performing schools and the students enrolled at the LEA as a whole. The LEA will also need to explain why they are required to develop the goal. This will include identifying the schools that are identified on the low performing schools list and how the actions and associated metrics in the goal differ from previous efforts to improve outcomes for the school. Why the LEA believes the actions, metrics, and expenditures included in the goal will help achieve the outcomes for the students enrolled at the schools identified in the goal description. And this goal must include metrics, outcomes, actions, and expenditures specific to addressing the needs of and improving outcomes for students enrolled at these schools and addressing disparities in performance between the schools and the LEA. An LEA required to address multiple schools is not required to address each school separately. However, each school must be specifically addressed in the goal. And now we're going to look at where this information connects in the plan summary in the LCAP. In the plan summary section, LEAs that are required to include a goal to address a consistently low performing student group or consistently low performing schools need to identify that the goal is required and identify the applicable student group or groups and or eligible schools. This provides a context for the LCAP reader in the identified needs sections that indicates there is a specific goal in the plan addressing the specific need. We will shift now to the CSI prompts that are the last component within the plan summary section in the LCAP. This section only applies to LEAs with the school or schools identified for CSI based on the 2022 dashboard data. The CSI list released in February identifies all schools that need to be identified for each LEA. It is important to note that this list may include schools that were eligible last year, as well as schools that are newly eligible. The response will need to address how the LEA is supporting the identified schools in developing their CSI plan for the 23-24 school year, as well as how the LEA will monitor and evaluate the plan to support student and school improvement. For the first CSI prompt, LEAs will need to provide the names of the schools identified for CSI. In the second prompt, the LEA will describe how they supported the CSI school in developing their CSI plan. This description needs to address how the LEA has supported or will support the CSI school or schools with conducting a school-level needs assessment and data analysis, identifying evidence-based interventions, and identifying any resource inequities to be addressed through the plan for the 23-24 school year. The last prompt asks for a description of how the LEA will monitor and evaluate the implementation of the CSI plan and how the LEA will monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the plan. Keep in mind that the response to these CSI prompts should focus on how the LEA is supporting the eligible CSI school or schools. In situations where an identified school was also a CSI school this year, the response should reflect the LEA's process for supporting the schools with plan development, implementation, and evaluation for the 23-24 school year. It is likely that the monitoring and evaluation of this year's plan may inform the needs assessment for the new plan. And moving on, we're circling back to the information previously shared for the DOS community of practice schools eligible for CSI based on low graduation rate. Here, this chart summarizes how the prompts apply for these eligible schools. For LEAs with DOS COP schools eligible for CSI based on low graduation rate that select the option to forego improvement activities, only prompt 1 applies. And here the LEA would include the standardized response provided on slide 43. This statement is provided for transparency purposes to indicate that the school, in collaboration with the local educational agency and educational partners, are forgoing improvement activities and applicable funding. For single school districts or districts direct funded charter schools with DOS COP schools eligible under the CSI low graduation criteria that elect to use the LCAP to meet the CSI planning requirements, CSI prompts 2 and 3 in the LCAP plan summary are required. And then for traditional LEAs with DOS COP schools under the same eligibility low graduation rate criteria that are using the LCAP to meet the CSI planning requirements, all CSI prompts in the LCAP plan summary are required. And the next slide provides, for your reference, some links to several LCAP resources and trainings that we have shared to date to support your work with the LCAP. This includes our recorded workshop trainings and the recently updated ELCAP guide for those using the ELCAP to develop the 23-24 plan. It was noted in the chat questions about if the ELCAP is available. It is, it's been open and it's available to rollover plans, and the guide is provided as one of the resources. Also included here are links to CDE resources, including the LCAP template and instructions, action tables, budget overview for parents template, and the CDE LCAP webinars. All right, and before turning the meeting over to Bonnie to close out today's meeting, we have our next meeting date listed there for you.